My name is Natalie Brooks. I am 42 years old, and for the past 18 years I have served this nation as an officer in the United States Air Force. I have commanded missions that most people will never know existed. I have carried classified burdens that kept millions safe while quietly sacrificing pieces of my own soul along the way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But the deepest wound I ever received didn't come from enemy fire or foreign threats. It came from the people who shared my last name, my own blood, in front of 200 military personnel at my father's retirement ceremony. I still remember the taste of champagne turning bitter in my mouth as I stood there in full dress uniform, watching my family tear me apart in public. My father, Lieutenant Colonel Derek Brooks, receiving his final salute after 30 years of distinguished service. My mother Rachel, radiant in her navy dress, basking in the attention. My younger brother Marcus and his wife Vanessa positioned perfectly for the cameras like they were posing for a magazine cover. And then there was me, the decorated Air Force colonel, being called a disappointment by the very people who should have been proudest. They said I had wasted my potential. They mocked my choice to serve, claiming I was running away from real responsibility. They painted me as cold, distant, a woman so consumed with playing soldier that I had forgotten how to be human. Marcus stood at the podium during the family tribute, his voice carrying across the room as he spoke about sacrifice and dedication, about family members who understand what truly matters. His eyes found mine in the crowd, and with a smile that looked warm to everyone else but felt like ice to me, he said the words that would haunt me for months to come. Some people chase medals and glory in faraway places, but real heroes take care of what's right in front of them. They don't abandon the people who need them most. The room erupted in applause. Officers I had served with, people who knew my record, my accomplishments, clapped politely while confusion flickered across their faces. I stood frozen, feeling the weight of every star on my uniform, every commendation, every life I had saved, reduced to nothing by a brother who had never spent a single day in service. But I stayed silent. I let them speak. I let the world believe their version of who I was, because I had learned something in the military that they would never understand. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. Sometimes you wait, you gather, you prepare, and when your moment comes, you strike with precision that leaves no room for doubt. And when that moment arrived 3 hours later, when General Patricia Hayes took the microphone and the entire base fell silent, I reached for something I had been carrying all evening. A single manila envelope, sealed, official, bearing the emblem of the United States Air Force Space Command. I approached the stage slowly, deliberately, every step echoing in the sudden quiet of that packed officers' club. I handed the envelope to General Hayes. She opened it, read the first line, then the second. I watched her face change, watched her eyes widen with something between shock and admiration. She looked up at me, then at my family, then back at the document in her hands. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, "before we conclude this evening's festivities, there's something you all need to know about Colonel Natalie Brooks." My father went pale. Marcus's confident smile faltered. Vanessa gripped her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white, and my mother, who had spent the entire evening avoiding my gaze, finally looked directly at me for the first time in years. 3 weeks ago, General Hayes continued, Colonel Brooks completed the most successful classified operation in our squadron's history. An operation that prevented a cyber attack on our nation's power grid, saved countless civilian lives, and captured a network of foreign operatives who had been planning this assault for over 2 years. The room was so quiet I could hear the air conditioning humming in the walls. "What you may not know," she said, her voice growing stronger, "is that Colonel Brooks didn't just participate in this mission. She designed it. She led it. And when her team was compromised and extraction became impossible, she stayed behind to ensure the mission's success, knowing it might cost her life." I felt the weight of 200 pairs of eyes on me. Officers who had dismissed me moments earlier now stared with something approaching awe. But I wasn't looking at them. I was looking at my family, watching their carefully constructed narrative crumble in real time. Furthermore, General Hayes announced, reaching for another document, effective immediately, Colonel Brooks has been selected for promotion to Brigadier General, making her the youngest woman in Air Force history to achieve this rank in Space Operations Command. The applause started slowly, then built like thunder. Officers rose to their feet. People I had never met before began cheering. But through it all, I kept my eyes on Marcus, watching his face cycle through disbelief, anger, and something that might have been fear. Because what they didn't know yet, what I had discovered during those 3 weeks of classified operations, was that the foreign operatives we captured weren't just random enemies of the state. They were connected to a domestic network of financial fraud, identity theft, and espionage that reached into the very heart of military families. And one of the names that kept appearing in our intelligence reports, buried deep in the data, but unmistakably present, was Marcus Brooks. The truth was about to come out. And as General Hayes folded the documents and handed them back to me, as my father's retirement celebration transformed into my vindication, I felt nothing but a cold, quiet certainty. Some battles aren't fought on foreign soil. Some battles happen in rooms full of people you thought you could trust, under bright lights, with the weight of truth pressing down on everyone present. This was my battlefield, and I had already won. The first crack in my perfect military family appeared on a Tuesday morning in March, exactly 6 months before my father's retirement ceremony. I was sitting in my downtown Denver apartment, reviewing classified mission reports over black coffee, when an email notification chimed on my personal laptop. The subject line made me pause. Confirmation of family emergency leave request approved. I frowned at the screen. I hadn't requested any emergency leave. My schedule was packed with training exercises and security briefings for the next 3 months. At first I assumed it was a system error, one of those administrative glitches that plague military databases. But when I clicked through to the details, my blood turned cold. The request had been filed using my military ID number, my personal information, and my digital signature. It claimed I needed immediate leave to handle a family financial crisis involving my elderly parents' medical expenses. The leave had been approved for 6 weeks, and according to the records, I had already been absent from duty for the past 10 days. I closed the laptop and reached for my secure phone. Within minutes, I was connected to my commanding officer, Colonel Ryan Foster, who sounded confused when I identified myself. "Brooks, I thought you were in Colorado Springs, dealing with your family situation. Your brother called last week to update us on your mother's condition." My mother was perfectly healthy. She played tennis 3 times a week and had just returned from a cruise to Alaska. And Marcus had no authority to speak on my behalf to anyone, let alone my military superiors. "Sir, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I'm currently in Denver, ready for duty. I never filed for emergency leave." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat. "Colonel, I'm looking at paperwork with your signature and your military ID. Are you telling me these documents are fraudulent?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you, sir." That afternoon, I drove to Peterson Space Force Base and spent 4 hours in a secure conference room with military investigators, going through every detail of the fraudulent leave request. The signature looked perfect, almost too perfect. The documentation was flawless, complete with backup forms I had never seen before. Someone had done their homework. But there was one detail that bothered me, a small inconsistency that kept nagging at the back of my mind. The emergency contact information listed Marcus as my primary family representative, authorized to make decisions on my behalf. That designation required specific paperwork, forms I had never filled out, permissions I had never granted. I drove home through rush hour traffic, my mind spinning. The Denver skyline blurred past my windows, as I tried to piece together what was happening. Marcus worked as a civilian contractor for various defense companies, moving from project to project with the kind of flexibility that had always made my father proud. He understood military systems, military bureaucracy. He would know exactly how to file paperwork that looked legitimate. But why would he want me away from my duties? What could he possibly gain from creating a fake family emergency? The answer came 2 days later, buried in a routine security briefing about cyber threats to military personnel. Our intelligence officer, Lieutenant Sofia Martinez, was reviewing cases of identity theft targeting service members, when she mentioned a pattern they had been tracking. "We're seeing sophisticated fraud operations that specifically target military families," she explained to our assembled team. "The perpetrators use insider knowledge to file false benefit claims, redirect military pay, and even access classified information by impersonating active duty personnel." She clicked through a series of slides showing financial documents, forged signatures, and fake emergency requests remarkably similar to what had happened to me. The common factor in all these cases is that the fraud is being committed by people with intimate knowledge of military procedures. In most instances, we're looking at family members or close associates of the victims. I sat very still in that briefing room, feeling pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. After the meeting, I approached Lieutenant Martinez privately. Sophia, I need to ask you something confidential. If someone wanted to access classified information by impersonating a serving officer, what would be the most effective method? She studied my face carefully. Are you asking hypothetically, or is this related to an active concern? Active concern. Then I'd say the easiest path would be through emergency protocols. If someone could establish themselves as an authorized family representative during a crisis situation, they could potentially gain access to sensitive information under the guise of helping an incapacitated service member. My mouth went dry. What kind of information? Deployment schedules, security clearances, mission parameters.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Basically anything that might be shared with family during a legitimate emergency. That evening, I sat alone in my apartment and began a careful review of my personal and military records. I started with bank statements, looking for anything unusual, any transactions I didn't recognize. For the first hour, everything looked normal. But then I noticed something odd in my military benefits account. Small amounts of money, usually under $50, had been transferred out of my account every few weeks for the past 8 months. The transactions were labeled as family support payments, a legitimate program that allows service members to send automatic assistance to relatives. But I had never enrolled in any family support program. I traced the payments to an account registered under Brooks Family Trust, an entity I had never heard of despite carrying the family name. The trust's listed address was my parents' house in Lakewood, but the authorized signatory wasn't my father or my mother. It was Marcus. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the computer screen, feeling the first real flutter of fear in my chest. This wasn't just about money. Someone was systematically infiltrating my military identity, using my credentials, my access, my reputation, and that someone was my own brother. The next morning, I called my parents' house. My mother answered, her voice warm and familiar. "Natalie, sweetheart, how wonderful to hear from you. Your father and I were just talking about the retirement ceremony. Are you excited?" I kept my voice casual, conversational. "Of course, Mom. Hey, I have a question about some paperwork I received. Something about a Brooks family trust. I don't remember setting up anything like that." The pause was brief, but it was there. When she spoke again, her tone had shifted slightly, becoming more careful. "Oh, that's something Marcus organized. You know how good he is with financial planning. He said it would help with tax benefits for the whole family. Did I sign anything for this trust?" Another pause. "I'm sure you did, dear. Marcus handles all that complicated paperwork. You've been so busy with your military duties." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Mom, can you put Marcus on the phone? He's not here right now. He and Vanessa are in Colorado Springs on business. Something about a new contract." Colorado Springs. Where Peterson Space Force Base was located. Where my unit was stationed. Where someone with the right credentials and the right insider knowledge could potentially access information they had no business seeing. I hung up the phone and immediately called Lieutenant Martinez. "Sophia, I need to report a potential security breach. And I think it's coming from inside my own family." Over the next week, we began a quiet, careful investigation. We couldn't move too quickly or too obviously without alerting whoever was responsible, but we started monitoring my accounts, my communications, my access records. What we found was more sophisticated than simple financial fraud. Someone had been systematically gathering intelligence about my missions, my clearance level, my deployment schedules. They had accessed personnel files for members of my unit, downloaded training materials for classified operations, and even attempted to obtain blueprints for secure facilities. The digital footprints all led back to accounts and devices, registered to Marcus Brooks and his wife Vanessa. But the pattern of access suggested they weren't working alone. The timing was too precise, the targeting too specific. Someone with significant knowledge of military intelligence operations was directing their activities. Late one night, as I sat in the secure briefing room, reviewing the evidence we had gathered, Lieutenant Martinez made an observation that chilled me to the bone. "Colonel, look at the dates of these unauthorized access attempts. They correspond almost exactly with your deployment schedule over the past 2 years. Whoever is doing this has been tracking your movements, your missions, your responsibilities. They know when you're overseas and unable to monitor your own accounts." I stared at the timeline she had created, seeing my own life mapped out in data points and security breaches. Every time I had been serving my country abroad, someone had been back home stealing my identity, piece by piece. "There's something else," Martinez continued, her voice grim. "We've identified similar patterns in the records of 12 other military personnel. All of them are high-ranking officers, with significant security clearances. All of them have family members working as civilian contractors with defense companies." The scope of what we were uncovering began to crystallize. This wasn't just personal betrayal, this was organized espionage, using military families as unwitting sources of classified information. And at the center of it all was my brother Marcus. The same person who would stand at my father's retirement ceremony 6 months later and call me a failure for choosing service over family. The irony was almost unbearable. While I had been overseas protecting national security, the real threat to our country had been sitting at my childhood dinner table, passing the mashed potatoes, and planning the next phase of his operation. But I didn't confront him. Not yet. Because in the military, you learn that the best time to act isn't when you first discover the enemy. It's when you can be certain that your strike will be decisive, complete, and leave no room for escape. I began to wait, to watch, to gather evidence with the patience of a sniper. Because I knew that my moment would come. And when it did, I intended to end this war in a way that Marcus would never forget. The investigation consumed the next 4 months of my life. Every spare moment between official duties was spent building a case that would withstand the scrutiny of both military justice and federal law enforcement. Lieutenant Martinez and I worked in shifts, carefully documenting each breach, each fraudulent transaction, each unauthorized access to classified systems. What we discovered went far beyond simple identity theft. Marcus and Vanessa had constructed an elaborate network of shell companies and fake identities, all designed to siphon money from veteran benefit programs, while simultaneously gathering intelligence that could be sold to foreign actors. The sophistication of their operations suggested training, resources, and connections that reached well beyond what 2 civilian contractors could manage on their own. The breakthrough came in July, 3 months before my father's retirement ceremony. Martinez had been monitoring Marcus's digital communications when she detected an encrypted message exchange between his primary email account and a server located in Eastern Europe. The encryption was military-grade, far beyond what any legitimate civilian contractor would need for normal business operations. We couldn't decrypt the messages immediately, but we could track the timing and frequency of the communications. The pattern that emerged was disturbing. Every time I received orders for a new mission, every time my security clearance was updated, every time my unit's operational status changed, Marcus sent encrypted messages to his overseas contact within hours. "He's not just stealing from you," Martinez explained during one of our late-night briefings. "He's providing real-time intelligence about Air Force Space Operations Command to foreign agents. The financial fraud is just a cover story, a way to fund the espionage operation while making it look like petty theft." I sat in the fluorescent-lit conference room, feeling the weight of betrayal settle deeper into my bones. This wasn't about money or family resentment. My brother was actively working against the country I had sworn to protect, using my own identity and access as his primary intelligence source. The personal pain of that realization was almost overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on the operational implications. If Marcus had been feeding information about my missions to foreign agents, how many other operations had been compromised? How many lives had been put at risk because of intelligence that originated from my own family? Over the following weeks, we expanded the investigation to include a joint task force with the FBI and the Defense Intelligence Agency. What we found was a network of military family members across multiple branches of service, all connected through Marcus's contracting work and Vanessa's counseling practice. They had been recruiting the spouses and relatives of service members, exploiting financial desperation and personal grievances to turn family members into unwitting intelligence assets. The operation was elegant in its simplicity. Vanessa would identify military families experiencing financial stress through her counseling practice, then Marcus would approach them with opportunities for easy money through his various business ventures. Once they were financially dependent on the arrangement, the requests would gradually escalate from simple personal information to copies of documents, access codes, and eventually classified intelligence. The families involved had no idea they were participating in espionage. They thought they were helping with legitimate business research or administrative tasks. But the cumulative effect of their small contributions had given foreign agents unprecedented insight into American military operations across the globe. As the evidence mounted, I found myself living a double life that felt surreal even by military standards. During the day, I carried out my official duties as a space operations colonel, briefing senior officers on satellite defense systems and cyber warfare protocols. In the evenings, I huddled in secure rooms with federal agents, building a case against my own brother that could potentially implicate dozens of military families and expose a massive breach of national security. The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the complex investigation. It was maintaining normal family relationships while knowing what I knew. Phone calls with my parents became exercises in controlled deception, carefully probing for information without revealing the scope of what we had discovered. Conversations with Marcus required acting skills I hadn't known I possessed, pretending to be the distant, self-absorbed sister he expected while mentally cataloging every word he said for potential evidence. The strain began to show in unexpected ways. I lost weight without noticing, surviving on military-issued energy bars and black coffee for days at a time. My sleep became fragmented, interrupted by dreams where I was simultaneously pursuing and being pursued through endless corridors that looked like my childhood home. During routine training exercises, I would find myself scanning the faces of fellow officers, wondering which of them might have family members involved in similar schemes. Lieutenant Martinez noticed my deteriorating condition before I did. One evening in late August, as we were reviewing surveillance footage from one of Marcus's business meetings, she looked up from her computer screen and studied my face with the analytical precision she usually reserved for intelligence reports. "Colonel, when's the last time you took leave?" I couldn't remember. The investigation had become all-consuming, a 24-hour obsession that left no room for rest or recovery. "The operation is too critical," I replied, turning back to the surveillance monitor. "We can't afford to slow down now. We also can't afford to have you burn out before we reach the prosecution phase. You're the primary witness in this case. If you collapse from exhaustion, months of work become worthless." She was right, of course, but the idea of stepping away even temporarily felt impossible. Every day we delayed was another day Marcus could discover our investigation, another opportunity for him to destroy evidence or warn his foreign contacts. The window for a successful prosecution was narrow, and I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out. That feeling proved prophetic 3 days later when Marcus called me directly for the first time in months. "Natalie, I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for lunch this weekend?" His tone was casual, almost friendly, but something in his voice set off alarm bells. Marcus rarely initiated contact with me, and he had never suggested a face-to-face meeting without some family occasion to justify it. "Is everything okay with Mom and Dad?" "They're fine. This is about business. There's an opportunity I think you might be interested in, something that could benefit both of us." I agreed to meet him at a restaurant in downtown Denver, knowing that our conversation would be recorded by federal surveillance teams positioned throughout the area. If Marcus was beginning to suspect our investigation, this meeting might be our chance to gather direct evidence of his activities. The restaurant he chose was upscale, but not ostentatious, the kind of place where business deals were discussed over expensive steaks and imported wine. Marcus arrived 10 minutes early, already seated at a corner table with clear sightlines to all entrances. He had developed good operational security habits somewhere along the way, which confirmed my suspicions about the level of training he had received. He looked prosperous, confident, wearing a tailored suit that probably cost more than most Air Force officers earned in a month. His smile was warm and genuine, as he stood to greet me, the same expression he had worn throughout our childhood when he was about to talk me into some scheme that would inevitably get me in trouble. "You look tired, sis. The Air Force working you too hard?" I sat down across from him, hyper-aware of the recording devices hidden in my clothing and the federal agents positioned at nearby tables. Just keeping busy. You mentioned a business opportunity, right to the point, as always. He laughed, but his eyes remained calculating. I've been thinking about family lately, about how we've all grown apart over the years. You with your military career, me with my various projects. It occurred to me that we might be missing opportunities to help each other. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more confidential tone. I know the Air Force doesn't pay what you're worth, especially considering your security clearance and your access to sensitive information. And I know there are people in the private sector who would pay very well for consulting work from someone with your background. The offer was carefully phrased, technically legal on the surface, but clearly probing for my willingness to monetize classified information. I maintained a neutral expression while my mind raced through possible responses that would draw him into more explicit territory. What kind of consulting work? Market research primarily. Understanding how government decision-making processes work, what factors influence military procurement, that sort of thing. Nothing that would compromise operational security, just general insights that could help businesses navigate the federal contracting landscape. It was a practiced pitch, probably refined through dozens of similar conversations with other military family members. The requests would start small and seemingly innocent, then gradually escalate until the target was providing genuinely classified information without fully realizing they had crossed the line. I'd need to check with my ethics officers about any potential conflicts, I said carefully. The military has strict rules about outside employment. Of course. I wouldn't want you to do anything that could jeopardize your career. But maybe you could think about it. We could start with something simple, just to see how it goes. The conversation continued for another hour, with Marcus gradually revealing more details about his network of consultants and research assistants. By the time we parted ways, he had essentially outlined the entire recruitment and operational structure of his espionage network, all while believing he was conducting a routine family conversation. The federal agents were ecstatic when they reviewed the recording. For the first time, we had Marcus in his own words, describing how he recruited military personnel and their families, how he structured payments to avoid detection, and how he packaged the intelligence he gathered for transmission to foreign contacts. But I felt sick to my stomach as I listened to the playback. This was my brother, the same person who had taught me to ride a bicycle and helped me with math homework. The same person who had sent me care packages during my first deployment and called to check on me after difficult missions. Somewhere along the way, that person had been transformed into someone I no longer recognized, someone who saw me not as family, but as an intelligence asset to be exploited. The final phase of the investigation moved quickly after that. Armed with Marcus's recorded admissions, federal agents were able to obtain warrants for his financial records, his communications, and his business premises. The evidence they collected painted a picture of systematic espionage that had been operating for nearly 5 years, compromising dozens of military operations and generating millions of dollars in illegal payments. But even as we prepared for arrests and prosecutions, I knew that the most difficult confrontation was still ahead of me. Because in 6 weeks, I would have to sit through my father's retirement ceremony and pretend that nothing had changed, pretend that I was still the disappointing daughter who had chosen career over family. And then when Marcus stood up to deliver his speech about sacrifice and dedication, when he looked directly at me and called me a failure, I would have to remain silent and let him dig his own grave, just a little deeper before General Hayes revealed the truth that would destroy him forever. The weight of that knowledge sat on my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe, hard to sleep, hard to pretend that I was still the same person who had started this investigation 6 months earlier. Because the truth was, I wasn't the same person. The woman who would walk into that officers' club in September was someone harder, colder, more careful about trust than the naive colonel who had first noticed a suspicious email back in March. Some lessons can only be learned through betrayal. And some prices can only be paid with pieces of your own soul. The weeks leading up to my father's retirement ceremony were a masterclass in psychological endurance. Every family phone call became an exercise in careful performance, every casual conversation with Marcus a potential intelligence gathering opportunity. I had to compartmentalize my emotions so completely that sometimes I worried I was losing the ability to feel anything genuine at all. The federal task force had moved into the final surveillance phase, monitoring Marcus and Vanessa around the clock while building airtight cases against their foreign contacts. We knew the arrests would have to happen soon after the retirement ceremony, to avoid giving them time to destroy evidence or flee the country. The timing was delicate, requiring coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies and military commands. 3 weeks before the ceremony, I received the promotion notification that would change everything. The orders came through official channels, signed by the Chief of Staff of the Air Force himself, promoting me to Brigadier General effective immediately. The promotion was the culmination of my 18-year military career, recognition for achievements that included classified operations Marcus had been reporting to foreign agents for years. The irony was inescapable. While my brother had been portraying me as a failure to our family, while he had been systematically undermining my missions and endangering my fellow service members, the highest levels of military leadership had been preparing to elevate me to general officer rank. The disconnect between those two realities was so profound that I sometimes felt like I was living in parallel universes. I made the decision not to tell my family about the promotion in advance. They would learn about it at the ceremony, in front of 200 military personnel, at the moment when Marcus's carefully constructed narrative about my inadequacies would be publicly destroyed. It was perhaps cruel to orchestrate the revelation that way, but after months of watching him exploit my family relationships for espionage purposes, I had lost whatever sympathy I might once have felt for his feelings. The ceremony preparations became a study in contradictions. My mother called regularly to discuss catering details and guest arrangements, her voice bright with excitement about the celebration of my father's career. She had no idea that federal agents were photographing every person on the guest list, running background checks on family friends, and preparing arrest warrants for her son and daughter-in-law. Marcus was particularly attentive during this period, offering to help with logistics and coordinating with base personnel on technical requirements. His helpfulness made perfect sense from an intelligence perspective, as it gave him access to detailed information about ceremony attendees, security arrangements, and facility layouts. Information that would be valuable to foreign agents looking to identify and potentially recruit other military family members. I watched him work with a mixture of professional admiration and personal revulsion. He was good at what he did, charming and efficient, and utterly convincing in his role as the devoted family member. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have been grateful for his assistance and touched by his apparent investment in making the event special for our father. The final briefing with the federal task force took place 2 days before the ceremony. We met in a secure facility at Peterson Space Force Base, reviewing arrest procedures and evidence handling protocols. The scale of the operation had grown beyond anything I had initially imagined. In addition to Marcus and Vanessa, 17 other individuals would be arrested simultaneously across 6 different states, effectively dismantling an espionage network that had been operating for half a decade. Agent Kevin Torres, the FBI case coordinator, walked me through my role in the proceedings one final time. Your job is to act completely normal until General Hayes makes the announcement about your promotion. After that, we'll take over. You don't need to confront anyone directly or try to gather additional evidence. Just let the situation unfold. I nodded, but part of me wondered if I would be able to maintain my composure when the moment actually came. 6 months of investigation had taught me things about my family that I could never unknow, revealed betrayals that went far deeper than simple financial fraud. When Marcus stood up to speak about family loyalty and dedication, when he looked directly at me and called me a failure, would I be able to stay silent and let his words wash over me like they meant nothing? The night before the ceremony, I stood in my apartment looking at my dress uniform hanging in the closet. The blue fabric was pristine, the silver stars and ribbons arranged with military precision. Tomorrow those symbols would take on new meaning, as I was promoted to general officer rank in front of my family and peers. But tonight they felt like armor I was preparing to wear into battle. I thought about calling Marcus, some part of me still hoping for a last-minute revelation that would explain everything, that would restore him to the brother I remembered from childhood. But I knew that conversation would change nothing. The evidence was overwhelming, the foreign connections undeniable. Whatever had motivated him to betray his country and his family, it was too late for explanations or reconciliation. Instead, I called Lieutenant Martinez, who had become my closest confidant throughout the investigation. Any last-minute developments I should know about? Nothing significant. Marcus sent 3 encrypted messages to his overseas contact this afternoon, probably final intelligence reports before the ceremony. Agent Torres thinks he might be planning to disappear after the event, which makes the timing of our operation even more critical. Are you certain we can maintain operational security through tomorrow? As certain as we can be. But Natalie, I have to ask, are you prepared for what happens after the arrests? This is going to destroy your family relationships permanently. There's no coming back from something like this. I had been asking myself the same question for months. The answer was both simple and impossibly complex. My family relationships were destroyed the moment Marcus decided to use my military service as a tool for espionage. Everything else is just revealing that destruction to the world. After hanging up, I sat by my window and watched Denver's lights flicker across the valley below. Tomorrow would mark the end of my father's military career and the beginning of my tenure as a general officer. It would also mark the end of whatever illusions I had maintained about the people who shared my blood and my name. Some battles are fought with weapons and tactics. Others are fought with patience and evidence, and the quiet accumulation of truth. Tomorrow's battle would be fought with words and revelations, and the careful dismantling of lies that had taken years to construct. I had been preparing for this moment since the day I first noticed that suspicious email. Now all that remained was to walk into that officers' club, stand in my dress uniform, and let justice unfold with the precision I had learned to expect from military operations. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and cold, autumn air carrying the crisp promise of winter across the Colorado mountains. I arrived at the base early, ostensibly to help with final preparations, but actually to coordinate with the federal agents who would be positioned throughout the event. Their presence was invisible to casual observers, men and women in dress uniforms and civilian formal wear, who looked like any other ceremony attendees, but carried arrest warrants and federal badges. The Officers' Club had been transformed for the occasion, decorated with military honors and family photographs spanning my father's 30-year career. Tables were arranged around a small stage where he would receive his final salute, and the folded flag that represented his years of service. It looked like any other military retirement ceremony, a celebration of duty completed and sacrifice recognized. My family arrived together, my parents radiant with pride, Marcus and Vanessa dressed impeccably and carrying themselves with the confidence of people who believed they had successfully manipulated every situation to their advantage. Watching them interact with other military families, seeing Marcus charm senior officers with his knowledge of defense contracting and his apparent devotion to his service member sister, I felt a cold fury that I had to work to suppress. The ceremony began with traditional military protocol, the presentation of awards, and the reading of commendations that summarized my father's career. He had served with genuine honor, and nothing Marcus had done could diminish that record. But as I watched him accept accolades from officers who had no idea that his son was sitting in the audience planning espionage activities, I felt the weight of secrets that would soon explode into public view. Marcus delivered his family tribute with perfect emotional pitch, speaking about sacrifice and service, and the challenges military families face when careers require long separations and frequent relocations. His words were carefully chosen to sound supportive while subtly undermining my choices, painting me as someone who had prioritized personal ambition over family obligations. Military service asks a lot of families, he said, his voice carrying across the packed room. Some people understand that service means taking care of the people closest to you, making sure your family comes first. Others get caught up in chasing recognition and awards, forgetting that real honor comes from being present for the people who need you most. The audience murmured approval, many of them military families who had struggled with similar tensions between duty and personal relationships. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap, knowing that in 15 minutes, Marcus's definition of honor would be exposed as the cover story for systematic betrayal of everything he claimed to value. When General Hayes took the microphone for what the program listed as closing remarks, the room fell silent with the automatic deference military personnel show to senior flag officers. She was an imposing figure, silver-haired and authoritative, someone who had earned her stars through intelligence work and strategic planning rather than traditional combat operations. Before we conclude this evening's celebration, she began, I have some information to share that puts Lieutenant Colonel Brooks's service and this family's sacrifices in a broader context. I felt the shift in the room's energy as people recognized that something unexpected was about to happen. My father straightened in his chair, looking puzzled but pleased at the prospect of additional recognition. My mother smiled expectantly. Marcus maintained his confident expression, but I caught a flicker of something else in his eyes, a wariness that suggested some part of him had always known this moment might come. General Hayes opened the manila envelope I had given her and withdrew the promotion orders that would change my life forever. As she began to read, as she described the classified operations I had led, and the promotion that recognized my achievements, I watched my family's faces cycle through confusion, disbelief, and something approaching shock. But I was no longer focused on them. I was focused on the federal agents, who had begun moving through the room, with quiet efficiency, positioning themselves near exits, and monitoring specific individuals, whose names appeared on their arrest lists. In 5 minutes, this retirement ceremony would become a federal crime scene, and the family whose approval I had once craved would be exposed as something far different from what they appeared to be. The applause for my promotion was thunderous, 200 military personnel rising to acknowledge an achievement that made me the youngest female general in Air Force Space Operations Command history. But beneath the celebration, I could sense the tension building toward a climax that would redefine everything these people thought they knew about service, sacrifice, and the price of betrayal. As General Hayes handed me the promotion certificate, and the room erupted in cheers, I looked directly at Marcus, for the first time since his speech. His face had gone pale, his confident smile replaced by an expression of dawning comprehension. He finally understood that this ceremony wasn't just about celebrating my father's career or recognizing my achievements, it was about justice. And justice, as I had learned, during 6 months of patient investigation, sometimes comes dressed in formal military attire and announces itself with the precision of a perfectly executed operation. The moment General Hayes finished reading my promotion orders, the room transformed from celebration to something far more serious. Agent Torres appeared at the edge of the stage, his federal badge visible as he approached the microphone. The festive atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by the tense energy that accompanies law enforcement operations. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Special Agent Kevin Torres with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Please remain seated while we conduct official business. The words hit the room like a shockwave. Officers who had been applauding moments earlier now sat frozen, their eyes darting between the federal agents who had materialized throughout the venue and the family members who were supposed to be the guests of honor. My father's face had gone completely white. He looked around the room in bewilderment, clearly unable to process what was happening. My mother gripped her purse with both hands, her knuckles bone white against the black leather. But it was Marcus who drew my attention, watching as every trace of confidence drained from his expression, replaced by the look of a man who suddenly realized that all his careful planning had been anticipated and countered. Agent Torres stepped down from the stage and walked directly to our family table. The room was so quiet I could hear his footsteps echoing off the polished floors. When he stopped beside Marcus's chair, the silence became suffocating. Marcus Brooks, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage against the United States, wire fraud, identity theft, and violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. Marcus didn't move as Agent Torres began reading his rights. He sat perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, as if by not acknowledging what was happening he could somehow make it stop. But when the handcuffs clicked into place, the sound seemed to break whatever trance had held the room. Vanessa started to cry, a high-pitched keening that cut through the silence like a blade. "This is insane," she sobbed, looking around the room for support that wasn't coming. "He hasn't done anything wrong. This is some kind of mistake." A second agent approached her chair. "Vanessa Brooks, you are also under arrest for conspiracy to commit espionage, money laundering, and operating an unlicensed financial services business." As they led Marcus and Vanessa away, I remained seated at the family table, watching 200 military personnel process what they had just witnessed. Some looked shocked, others appeared confused, and a few seemed to be putting pieces together that they hadn't noticed before. The decorated family that had just been celebrating military service included foreign agents who had been systematically betraying the very institution they pretended to honor. My father finally found his voice. "Natalie, what is this? What's happening?" I looked at him across the table, this man who had shaped my understanding of duty and service, who had taught me that honor meant keeping your word even when it cost you everything. How could I explain that his son had been using that same sense of honor as a weapon against the country we had all sworn to protect? Dad, Marcus, and Vanessa have been running an espionage operation for the past 5 years. They've been stealing classified information from military personnel and selling it to foreign governments. The words sounded surreal even as I spoke them. 6 months of investigation had made the facts familiar to me, but saying them out loud to my father at his retirement ceremony felt like something from a nightmare. "That's impossible," my mother whispered. "Marcus is a patriot. He supports the military. He's proud of our family's service." Agent Torres had returned to our table, carrying a briefcase full of evidence that would soon become public record in federal court. "Mrs. Brooks, your son has been operating a network that compromised classified operations across multiple branches of the military. The financial records show payments totaling over $3 million from foreign intelligence services. $3 million. I had known the numbers from our investigation, but hearing them spoken aloud in front of my parents drove home the scale of Marcus's betrayal. This wasn't some minor indiscretion or momentary lapse in judgment. This was a sustained, deliberate campaign against American national security that had funded a lifestyle far beyond what any legitimate contractor could afford. My mother started to shake, her whole body trembling as if she was going into shock. "But the money for the house renovations, the cars, the vacations," Marcus said he was just successful with his business. "His business was espionage, ma'am. Everything else was cover." The room had begun to empty as military personnel were dismissed and federal agents completed their evidence collection. I sat with my parents in the growing quiet, watching them struggle to reconcile the son they thought they knew with the foreign agent he had actually become. My father aged 10 years in the space of that conversation. The proud military officer who had been celebrating his retirement an hour earlier now looked frail and confused, overwhelmed by revelations that undermined everything he thought he understood about his family. "Natalie, how long have you known?" The question I had been dreading. How could I explain that I had spent 6 months building a case against my own brother, attending family dinners and making casual conversation while gathering evidence that would send him to federal prison for the rest of his life? I started investigating in March, when I received fraudulent military documents with my forged signature. It took months to understand the full scope of what Marcus and Vanessa were doing. 6 months, my father's voice was hollow. "You knew for 6 months and said nothing." "I couldn't say anything, Dad. This was a federal investigation involving national security. I had to follow procedures, gather evidence, work with law enforcement." But even as I explained the operational requirements, I could see that my parents didn't understand. To them, I looked like someone who had chosen duty over family yet again, someone who had participated in destroying her own brother rather than trying to save him. "You could have warned him," my mother said quietly. "You could have told him to stop before it went this far." The suggestion hit me like a physical blow. Warn him, warn a foreign agent that his espionage activities had been discovered. Help him destroy evidence and escape prosecution for crimes that had endangered American lives around the world. "Mom, he was selling classified information to hostile foreign governments. He was using my military identity to access state secrets. Warning him would have made me complicit in espionage." "He's your brother." 2 words that encapsulated everything wrong with how my family understood loyalty and obligation. Yes, Marcus was my brother. He was also a traitor who had exploited our family relationships to commit crimes against the country I had sworn to defend. Those 2 facts couldn't be reconciled through wishful thinking or selective blindness. Lieutenant Martinez appeared at our table, her expression carefully neutral. "General Brooks, Agent Torres needs to debrief you before you leave." The title still sounded strange, even after the formal promotion ceremony. General Brooks, the youngest female general in Air Force Space Operations Command history, promoted on the same day her brother was arrested for espionage. The irony would probably be noted in every news story about the case. I stood to follow Martinez, then paused to look back at my parents. They sat at the table surrounded by the debris of what had been meant as a celebration, my father's retirement awards scattered among federal evidence bags and legal documents. "I'm sorry this happened at your ceremony, Dad. I'm sorry Marcus put us all in this position." He didn't respond. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. I left them there and walked across the empty officers' club, my heels echoing in the silence where 200 people had been celebrating just an hour before. The debriefing took place in a secure conference room at Peterson Space Force Base, the same facility where I had spent countless hours over the past 6 months building the case against Marcus. Agent Torres and Lieutenant Martinez walked me through the arrest procedures, the evidence that would be presented in court, and the testimony I would be required to provide during the prosecution phase. The arrests went smoothly, Torres reported. 17 individuals in custody across 6 states. We recovered laptops, financial records, and communication devices that should provide enough evidence to secure convictions on all the major charges. What about the foreign contacts? Those cases will be handled through diplomatic channels. The important thing is that we've dismantled the domestic network and secured the classified information that was being transmitted. I nodded, feeling a strange sense of anticlimax. 6 months of investigation, months of careful surveillance and evidence gathering, and it was over in a matter of hours. Marcus and Vanessa were in federal custody, their network was destroyed, and the threat to national security had been neutralized. But sitting in that conference room, I felt anything but victorious. The successful completion of the operation meant that I had helped send my own brother to prison, destroyed my family relationships, and proven once again that my commitment to duty would always take precedence over personal considerations. General, there's one more thing you should know, Martinez said quietly. The classified operations that Marcus compromised included missions where American lives were lost. 3 soldiers died in Afghanistan when their patrol routes were ambushed using intelligence that came from your stolen files. The revelation hit me like a punch to the chest. I had known that Marcus's espionage activities had operational consequences, but I hadn't realized that specific missions had been compromised, that real people had died because of information my brother had sold to foreign agents. Their names. Martinez handed me a classified folder containing casualty reports from operations that had been compromised by leaked intelligence. As I read the names and saw the photographs of young soldiers who had died because of my brother's betrayal, I felt something cold and final settle in my chest. Staff Sergeant Michael Chen, 26 years old, killed in an IED attack that had been possible because enemy forces knew his patrol schedule. Corporal Jennifer Martinez, 23 years old, died in an ambush that succeeded because hostile forces had advanced knowledge of her unit's movements. Private First Class David Thompson, 19 years old, lost his life when enemy fighters positioned themselves using intelligence that had originated from classified documents Marcus had accessed through my identity. 3 families had lost children because my brother had decided that foreign money was worth more than American lives. 3 military funerals had taken place because someone with access to classified information had chosen personal profit over operational security. I closed the folder and handed it back to Martinez, my hands perfectly steady despite the rage burning in my chest. I want to testify at his trial. I want to make sure the court understands exactly what his choices cost. General, you should consider the personal implications of that decision. Testifying against your brother in a federal espionage chase will probably end any possibility of reconciliation with your family. The warning was probably well-intentioned, but it missed the fundamental point. My family relationships had ended the moment Marcus decided to use my military service as a tool for espionage. Everything else was just paperwork and legal proceedings. Schedule me for whatever testimony you need. Marcus made his choices. Now he can live with the consequences. After the debriefing, I drove through the dark Colorado streets toward my downtown apartment, feeling hollowed out and strangely disconnected from everything around me. The promotion that should have been the highlight of my military career had been overshadowed by the arrest of my brother. The family ceremony that was supposed to celebrate my father's service had become a federal crime scene. I parked in my building's garage and sat in the car for several minutes, trying to process the day's events. In the space of a few hours, I had been promoted to general officer rank, exposed my brother as a foreign agent, and learned that his espionage activities had contributed to the deaths of 3 American soldiers. The personal cost of those revelations was something I would probably spend years calculating. My parents would never forgive me for choosing duty over family loyalty. Military colleagues would always wonder whether they could trust someone who had turned in her own brother. Even friends who understood the operational necessities would look at me differently, knowing that I was capable of that level of emotional compartmentalization. But as I finally made my way up to my apartment, I thought about Staff Sergeant Chen, Corporal Martinez, and Private Thompson. I thought about their families, about military parents who had received folded flags and condolence letters, because someone had decided that classified information was a commodity to be sold rather than a trust to be protected. Marcus had made his choice when he started selling state secrets to foreign agents. I had made mine when I decided that justice mattered more than family harmony. Some decisions create wounds that never fully heal, but they're still the right decisions to make. The apartment felt strange and unfamiliar, as if I was seeing it for the first time. 6 months of investigation had consumed so much of my mental energy that I had barely noticed my surroundings. Now, in the aftermath of arrests and revelations, the space seemed to belong to someone else, someone who still believed that family meant something beyond shared genetics and childhood memories. I hung my dress uniform in the closet, the new general's stars catching the light from the hallway. Tomorrow there would be interviews with military investigators, briefings with senior officers, and the beginning of legal proceedings that would probably continue for years. But tonight there was just silence, and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. I stood at my window looking out over Denver's lights, thinking about the soldiers who had died because of intelligence my brother had sold, and I made myself a promise. Whatever the personal cost, whatever the damage to family relationships, I would see this prosecution through to the end. Marcus would face the full consequences of his betrayal, and the families of the soldiers who had died would know that justice had been served. Some battles are fought with weapons and tactics, others are fought in courtrooms with evidence and testimony. Tomorrow I would begin the longest and most difficult battle of my military career, armed with nothing but the truth, and a determination to see justice done regardless of the personal price. The media firestorm began before dawn the next morning. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing with calls from reporters, news producers, and military public affairs officers trying to coordinate messaging around the biggest espionage scandal to hit the Air Force in decades. By the time I reached the base for my first briefing as a general officer, news vans lined the main gate and helicopter cameras circled overhead like mechanical vultures. The headlines were brutal and immediate. Air Force general's brother arrested in massive spy ring. Military family torn apart by espionage scandal. From hero to zero, the Brooks family betrayal. Every major network led with the story, most of them using split-screen images of me receiving my promotion alongside photos of Marcus being led away in handcuffs. Colonel Foster, my immediate superior, looked exhausted when I reported to his office. He had probably spent the night fielding calls from Pentagon officials and congressional staffers, demanding explanations for how a foreign espionage ring had operated undetected for 5 years using stolen military identities. Natalie, or should I say General Brooks, we need to discuss how to handle the media attention and the operational security implications of your family situation. The formality in his voice was new, a subtle reminder that my promotion had changed our professional relationship even as my personal circumstances had made me a potential liability. General officers were expected to maintain higher standards of conduct and security awareness, but they were also supposed to avoid becoming the center of public scandals. Sir, I understand that this situation creates complications for the command. I'm prepared to accept whatever restrictions you deem necessary. The Pentagon wants you to avoid all media contact until the legal proceedings are complete. No interviews, no statements, no public appearances beyond essential military duties. They're concerned that anything you say could compromise the prosecution or create additional security risks. The restrictions made operational sense, but they also meant that I would be unable to defend myself against the inevitable speculation about my role in the investigation and my family loyalties. News commentators were already questioning whether I had known about Marcus's activities earlier, whether I had waited too long to report suspicious behavior, whether a person who could turn in her own brother could be trusted with national security responsibilities. Over the following weeks, I learned to navigate the strange isolation that comes with being at the center of a major news story, while being prohibited from speaking about it. Colleagues treated me with careful professionalism, maintaining appropriate respect for my rank, while clearly uncertain about how to interact with someone whose family had become synonymous with betrayal and espionage. The worst part was the silence from my parents. They didn't call, didn't respond to my messages, didn't acknowledge the birthday flowers I sent to my mother, or the retirement gift I had selected for my father months before the arrests. Their rejection was total and absolute, as if I had died rather than simply chosen duty over family loyalty. 3 weeks after the ceremony, I received a single letter forwarded through military channels. My mother's handwriting on expensive stationery, the same elegant script I remembered from childhood thank you notes and birthday cards. Natalie, your father and I cannot understand how you could do this to your own family. Marcus may have made mistakes, but he is our son, and nothing he did justifies what you have done to him. We raised you to value family above everything else, but you have chosen strangers and institutions over the people who love you most. We cannot have someone in our lives who would betray their own blood for career advancement. Please do not contact us again. I read the letter 3 times, searching for any hint of understanding or forgiveness, any acknowledgement that Marcus's crimes had consequences beyond our family dynamics. But there was nothing except condemnation and a finality that felt like death. That evening, I called Lieutenant Martinez, who had become my closest confidant during the investigation, and remained one of the few people who fully understood what I had sacrificed to expose the espionage network. How are you holding up, General? My parents have disowned me. The media thinks I'm either a hero or a monster depending on which channel you watch, and I'm starting to question whether I made the right choices. You prevented foreign agents from accessing classified information that could have cost thousands of American lives. How is that not the right choice? She was correct from an operational perspective, but the emotional reality was more complicated. I had gained a promotion and prevented further security breaches, but I had lost my family and become a public symbol of fractured loyalties. Some victories felt indistinguishable from defeat. The legal proceedings moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. Marcus and Vanessa were held without bail, while federal prosecutors built cases that would probably result in life sentences. The other members of their network, military family members, who had been recruited gradually over years, faced lesser charges, but still confronted decades in federal prison. As the primary witness in the government's case, I spent hours with prosecutors reviewing evidence and preparing testimony that would establish the timeline of Marcus's activities and demonstrate the operational impact of his betrayal. The preparation was emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive months of investigation while maintaining the clinical detachment necessary for effective courtroom testimony. 4 months after the arrests, I was finally permitted to testify before a closed session of the House Intelligence Committee about the security failures that had allowed the espionage network to operate undetected. The hearing was classified, but the experience of explaining my family's situation to elected officials was surreal and humbling. Congressman Robert Chen, the committee chairman, was particularly pointed in his questioning. General Brooks, how can the American people trust that you will maintain appropriate security protocols when you spent 6 months investigating your own brother without reporting your suspicions to higher authority? Sir, I reported my suspicions to my commanding officer and federal law enforcement within days of discovering the initial evidence. The investigation was conducted under proper supervision with full knowledge of military and civilian leadership. But you continued to interact normally with your family while knowing that your brother was potentially a foreign agent.
Doesn't that represent a conflict of interest that should have disqualified you from the investigation? The question struck at the heart of doubts I had been carrying since the arrests. Had I been too personally invested in the investigation to maintain professional objectivity? Had my desire to prove Marcus's guilt affected my judgment about evidence and procedures? Congressman, removing me from the investigation would have alerted the suspects that their activities had been discovered. Maintaining normal family relationships was an operational necessity that allowed us to gather evidence and prevent the destruction of classified materials. Are you saying that deceiving your family was justified by the intelligence value? I'm saying that protecting national security required difficult personal choices. I made those choices based on my oath as an Air Force officer and my responsibility to protect classified information. The hearing continued for 3 hours, with committee members probing every aspect of the investigation and my family relationships. By the end, I felt as if I had been dissected and examined under a microscope, my motives and decisions analyzed by people who had never faced similar conflicts between duty and family loyalty. But the most difficult testimony came 6 months later, during Marcus's federal trial. I sat in a Denver courtroom wearing my dress uniform facing my brother across a room filled with reporters, federal agents, and military personnel. Marcus looked smaller than I remembered, diminished by months in federal custody and the weight of evidence that had accumulated against him. His defense attorney, an expensive Washington lawyer who specialized in espionage cases, tried to portray him as a patriotic American who had been manipulated by foreign agents and corrupted by financial pressures. The strategy required painting me as an ambitious officer who had sacrificed family relationships for career advancement, someone whose testimony couldn't be trusted because of personal motivations. General Brooks, isn't it true that you initiated this investigation because you were jealous of your brother's financial success? No, that is not true. Isn't it true that you had been estranged from your family for years before these charges were filed? My military service required frequent deployments and relocations, which created distance in family relationships. But we maintained regular contact and I participated in family events when possible. General Brooks, when you discovered that your brother might be involved in illegal activities, did you try to help him or warn him about the consequences of his actions? This was the question I had been dreading, the one that went to the heart of how I had chosen between competing loyalties. In the months since the arrests, I had replayed countless scenarios where I might have handled things differently, where I might have found a way to save Marcus while still protecting national security. I followed proper procedures for reporting suspected security violations. Warning someone who is potentially committing espionage would be illegal and would compromise ongoing investigations. So you chose your career over your family. I chose my oath to the Constitution over personal relationships. The prosecutor objected to the question's argumentative nature, but the damage was done. The defense had succeeded in framing my testimony as motivated by ambition rather than duty, personal betrayal rather than professional obligation. When I was finally dismissed from the witness stand, I avoided looking at Marcus directly. But as I walked past the defense table, I heard him whisper something that only I could hear. I hope it was worth it, Natalie. I hope destroying your family was worth your precious promotion. The words followed me out of the courtroom and stayed with me through the remainder of the trial. Marcus was ultimately convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Vanessa received 25 years. The other members of their network faced sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years depending on their level of involvement. The convictions were hailed as a major victory for national security, proof that the justice system could successfully prosecute complex espionage cases even when they involved military families. But sitting in my apartment the night the verdicts were announced, I felt no sense of triumph or vindication. I had succeeded in my mission to protect classified information and prevent further security breaches. I had been promoted to general officer rank and earned recognition as one of the Air Force's most effective counterintelligence officers. But I had also lost my family, become a public symbol of divided loyalties, and spent months questioning whether my choices had been motivated by duty or revenge. The phone rang as I was reviewing news coverage of the trial's conclusion. I expected another call from a reporter or a military public affairs officer, but the voice on the other end was unexpected. General Brooks, this is Colonel Sarah Martinez, calling from Walter Reed Medical Center. I'm contacting you because your father has been admitted to our cardiac care unit following a heart attack. He's stable now, but he's been asking for you. The drive to Washington took 6 hours, during which I wrestled with emotions I had been suppressing since the day of the arrests. My father was 70 years old, a decorated veteran who had served his country with honor for 3 decades. Whatever Marcus had done, whatever choices I had made, my father didn't deserve to face a medical crisis alone. I found him in a private room overlooking the Potomac River, connected to monitors and IV lines but alert and conscious. He looked frail in the hospital bed, older than his years and worn down by months of stress and public scrutiny. Natalie, his voice was weak but clear. You came. Of course I came, Dad. You're my father. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us struggling with words that seemed inadequate for the distance that had grown between us. Finally he spoke. I've been thinking about what you said at the ceremony, about Marcus making choices and living with consequences. I think I understand now that you didn't have any good options. Dad, I'm sorry about how everything happened. I'm sorry it had to be so public, so humiliating for you and Mom. Marcus destroyed this family, not you. It just took me months to understand the difference. The conversation was brief and carefully neutral, but it represented the first acknowledgement from my family that my choices had been driven by duty rather than malice. When visiting hours ended, my father squeezed my hand and said something that meant more to me than any military commendation. I'm proud of you, Natalie. I'm proud that you chose to do the right thing even when it cost you everything. I drove back to Colorado that night with a different understanding of what I had accomplished and what it had cost. The investigation had been successful from an operational standpoint, protecting national security and dismantling a dangerous espionage network. But the personal price had been higher than I had initially calculated, requiring sacrifices that would affect the rest of my life. Marcus would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, a consequence of choices he had made over years of deliberate betrayal. I would spend mine carrying the weight of those choices and their impact on everyone around us. Some burdens can't be shared or transferred, and some prices can only be paid in solitude and silence. But as I watched the Colorado mountains emerge from the dawn mist, I knew that I would make the same choices again if faced with similar circumstances. Because some duties transcend family relationships, and some oaths matter more than personal comfort. The price of integrity is often isolation, but it's still a price worth paying. 2 years after the trial concluded, I stood in the conference room of the newly established Military Family Security Initiative, watching Lieutenant Colonel James Walker brief a room full of intelligence officers on identifying and preventing espionage activities within military families. The irony wasn't lost on me that my family's destruction had become a case study for protecting other military families from similar infiltration. The initiative had been my proposal, developed during the long months of testimony and legal proceedings, when I realized that Marcus's network had exploited systemic vulnerabilities in how the military handled family access to sensitive information. Traditional security protocols focused on external threats, but they hadn't anticipated the possibility of family members being recruited as intelligence assets through gradual manipulation and financial pressure. The Brooks case demonstrates how adversaries can exploit family relationships over extended periods. Walker explained to the assembled officers. The perpetrators spent years building trust and financial dependency before making requests for classified information. By the time victims realized they were participating in espionage, they were too compromised to seek help through official channels. I listened from the back of the room, noting how clinical the language sounded when applied to my own family's destruction. Marcus had become the primary perpetrator, my parents were unwitting assets, and I was the reporting officer who initiated the investigation. The personal devastation was reduced to operational terminology that made it easier for other officers to study without becoming emotionally invested in the human cost. After the briefing, I walked across the base to my new office as Director of Family Security Operations, a position created specifically to address the vulnerabilities that Marcus's network had exposed. The title sounded important, but the reality was more complicated. I was essentially the Air Force's expert on family betrayal, the person they called when military families were suspected of security violations. My assistant, Captain Angela Rodriguez, had arranged my schedule with military precision. 3 briefings on ongoing investigations, 2 meetings with federal prosecutors, and a conference call with Pentagon officials who were implementing new security protocols based on lessons learned from the Brooks case. The work was necessary and important, but it also meant spending my days immersed in stories of families torn apart by espionage, greed, and manipulation. Every case file was a reminder of what I had lost, and what other military families were losing when duty conflicted with personal loyalty. Late that afternoon, as I reviewed intelligence reports about suspected foreign recruitment activities targeting military spouses, Captain Rodriguez knocked on my office door. "General, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." I looked up from the classified documents spread across my desk, expecting another reporter or legal representative. Instead, I saw a woman in her 30s wearing civilian clothes, her face marked by stress and exhaustion. "General Brooks, my name is Jennifer Chen. My husband was Staff Sergeant Michael Chen." The name hit me like a physical blow. Staff Sergeant Chen was one of the 3 soldiers who had died in Afghanistan due to intelligence compromised by Marcus's espionage activities. I had read his casualty report dozens of times, memorized the details of his death, but I had never met his family. "Mrs. Chen, please sit down. I'm so sorry for your loss." She took the chair across from my desk but remained tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "I wanted to meet you because I needed to understand what happened to my husband. The Army gave me the official reports, but they didn't explain how his patrol route was compromised or why the enemy knew where to place the IED. I had dreaded this conversation for 2 years, knowing that eventually I would have to face the families of the soldiers who had died because of my brother's betrayal. How do you explain to a widow that her husband died because your brother sold classified information for money? "Mrs. Chen, I can share what's been declassified about the intelligence breach that affected your husband's unit. But I want you to know that I understand if you blame me for what happened." She studied my face carefully, looking for something I couldn't identify. "I did blame you for a long time. I couldn't understand how someone's own sister wouldn't know they were a traitor. I thought you must have suspected something and ignored it. I didn't know until I started investigating the fraudulent documents with my signature. By then, the intelligence had already been compromised and the damage was done. The prosecutors explained the timeline during the trial. They said you stopped an ongoing espionage operation that could have cost hundreds more lives. That doesn't bring your husband back. She was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the mountains visible beyond the base perimeter. When she spoke again, her voice was steady but filled with exhaustion. No, it doesn't. But I wanted you to know that Michael would have respected what you did. He believed in duty above everything else, even family. He would have made the same choice you made. Her words stayed with me long after she left my office. I had spent 2 years questioning whether my decisions had been motivated by duty or personal ambition, whether I had acted too quickly or waited too long, whether there had been some way to save both my family and protect national security. But Jennifer Chen's visit reminded me that the consequences of Marcus's espionage weren't abstract policy concerns or theoretical security breaches. Real people had died because of intelligence he had sold to foreign agents. Real families had been destroyed by his betrayal, not just our own. That evening, I drove to a quiet overlook in the foothills west of Colorado Springs, a place where I had often gone to think during the darkest periods of the investigation and trial. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of autumn evenings from my childhood. I thought about the officer I had been 2 years earlier, someone who still believed that family relationships were sacred and that love could overcome any betrayal. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder and more cautious, someone who understood that trust was a luxury that people in my position couldn't afford. But sitting on that mountainside, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, I realized that the loss wasn't entirely negative. The investigation had taught me things about duty and integrity that I couldn't have learned any other way. It had shown me that principles mattered more than personal comfort, that some oaths were worth keeping regardless of the cost. My phone buzzed with a text message from my father, one of the brief communications we had maintained since his heart attack. Saw the news story about your new program. Proud of what you're building. The Military Family Security Initiative had been featured in several military publications as an innovative approach to counterintelligence that addressed evolving threats to national security. But for me, it was more personal than that. It was an attempt to prevent other families from experiencing what mine had endured, to protect military children from discovering that their parents were foreign agents, to spare other officers from having to choose between family loyalty and professional duty. Over the following months, the initiative began showing results. We identified 3 separate espionage operations targeting military families, disrupting them before classified information could be compromised. We established new protocols for monitoring family access to sensitive materials, and created support systems for military personnel who discovered security violations by relatives. Each successful intervention felt like a small redemption, proof that something constructive could emerge from the destruction of my own family. But the work also reminded me daily of what I had lost and could never recover. On the 3rd anniversary of Marcus's arrest, I received an unexpected letter forwarded through the federal prison system. My brother's handwriting on institutional stationery, the first communication I had received from him since his conviction. Natalie, I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need to say some things before more time passes. I've had 3 years to think about what I did and why I did it, and I understand now that I destroyed everything that mattered for money that was never worth it. I'm not asking for forgiveness because I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to visit because I know you can't. I just want you to know that you were right to stop me, right to choose duty over family loyalty. The soldiers who died because of what I did deserved better from both of us. I'm sorry it took me this long to understand that. I read the letter several times, searching for manipulation or self-pity, but finding only something that might have been genuine remorse. It didn't change anything fundamental about our relationship or my understanding of his choices, but it provided a form of closure I hadn't expected to receive. That weekend, I drove to the National Cemetery, where Staff Sergeant Chen was buried, along with Corporal Martinez and Private Thompson, the other soldiers who had died due to compromised intelligence. I had never visited their graves before, reluctant to intrude on family grief with my own complicated emotions. The headstones were simple and dignified, marking the resting places of young people who had died serving their country. I placed flowers at each grave, and stood in silence, thinking about the lives that had been cut short by my brother's betrayal, and the families who would carry that loss forever. As I prepared to leave, I noticed a woman approaching Staff Sergeant Chen's grave, carrying fresh flowers. Jennifer Chen looked older than when I had met her in my office, but she moved with quiet dignity as she arranged the flowers and knelt beside the headstone. She noticed me standing nearby and nodded in acknowledgement. "General Brooks, I come here every Sunday. I hope I'm not intruding. I wanted to pay my respects." Michael would have appreciated that. We stood together in comfortable silence, two women whose lives had been forever changed by espionage and betrayal, finding a moment of peace in a place dedicated to service and sacrifice. "Mrs. Chen, I want you to know that the program we've established has prevented 3 other intelligence breaches. Your husband's death wasn't meaningless. I know I've been following the news about your work. Michael always said that the best way to honor fallen soldiers is to prevent others from dying the same way." As I drove home from the cemetery, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. I had lost my family and gained a deeper understanding of duty. I had been promoted to general officer rank, but sacrificed personal relationships that could never be restored. I had prevented future security breaches, but carried the weight of past failures that would follow me forever. The sun was setting behind the mountains as I reached my apartment, painting the sky in familiar shades of gold and crimson. I thought about the officer I had been before the investigation began, someone who still believed that family loyalty and professional duty could be reconciled through careful navigation and good intentions. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some choices create permanent consequences, that some prices can only be paid in isolation and sacrifice. But she was also someone who had learned that integrity mattered more than comfort, that principles were worth defending regardless of personal cost. I stood at my window looking out over the lights of Colorado Springs, knowing that tomorrow would bring new cases of family betrayal and security violations, new stories of military personnel forced to choose between love and duty. The work would continue, because the threats were ongoing, because families would always be vulnerable to exploitation by adversaries who understood that personal relationships could be weaponized against national security. But I also knew that the program we had built was making a difference, protecting other military families from experiencing the destruction that had consumed my own. That knowledge wouldn't restore my relationships with my parents, or bring back the soldiers who had died because of Marcus's espionage, but it provided a sense of purpose that transcended personal loss. Some battles are fought with weapons and tactics on distant battlefields. Others are fought in courtrooms and conference rooms with evidence and testimony. The most difficult battles are fought within families, where love and duty collide with forces too powerful for either to overcome alone. I had won my battle through patience and investigation, and an unwavering commitment to principles that mattered more than personal comfort. The victory had cost me everything I thought I valued most, but it had also taught me that some things were worth any sacrifice. The stars emerged in the darkening sky above Colorado Springs, the same stars that had watched over countless military families facing impossible choices between competing loyalties. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to protect people who served their country from those who would exploit their service for personal gain. I was ready for whatever came next, armed with hard-won wisdom about the price of integrity and the weight of duty. Because some truths can only be learned through betrayal, and some strengths can only be forged in the fire of family destruction. The woman who stood at that window was not the same person who had first noticed a suspicious email 3 years earlier. She was someone harder and more cautious, someone who understood that trust was earned, and that family relationships could be as dangerous as foreign enemies when corrupted by greed and manipulation. But she was also someone who had proven that principles mattered more than personal relationships, that duty could triumph over blood ties when the stakes were high enough. And in a world where military families faced increasing threats from adversaries who understood the power of intimate betrayal, that knowledge would have to be enough. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.